Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled The Role of Nuclear Power in a Carbon Neutral World. We're grateful to Dr. Thomas-Olivier Leautier and Kazu Toyoda and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. We're also grateful to IEEJ in Japan for co-hosting this webinar with IAEE. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please use Zoom's Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window to type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now we have a bit of a matter in that our moderator has not showed at this current time. So I will introduce the webinar and our distinguished speakers in hopes that Thomas will be able to join us in a little bit. For this, I am going to read to you the description of the webinar and then introduce our first speaker. In January, as Texas in February, Japan faced a power crisis due to the much colder temperature than usual and the complex constraints of issues in LNG global supply. But the very underlying factor that caused this crisis was a slow achievement of the adequate power generation mix, including the slow restart of nuclear reactors. After assessing nuclear power's contribution to the energy security, Japan determined that she favored a share of nuclear in the power generation mix of 20 to 22% by 2023. Unfortunately, however, nuclear energy in Japan currently accounts for just 6% of total power generation, while its share before Fukushima nuclear accident was more in line with 30%. Such a small share comes mainly from the slow process of restart approval, injunctions issued by Japan's local courts, and time-consuming anti-terrorism facilities and construction. In general, this is what this webinar will address today by our keynote speaker, Kazu Toyoda, and our distinguished 2 speakers. To start, Toyoda, if I may introduce you, you are currently the chairman and CEO of the Institute of Energy Economics Japan, which is ranked among the top 3 energy resource policy think tanks for 7 consecutive years in the Global Go to Think Tank Index reports by the University of Pennsylvania. Toyoda-san, you're a personal friend and colleague in the energy field. It's my pleasure to introduce you today to present this keynote address. Toyoda, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for your kind introduction. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Kazu Toyoda, as introduced, the CEO and chairman of Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. It's a think tank on energy and environment. Thank you very much for having me to join a very interesting panel discussion on the role of nuclear in the carbon neutral world. It is true that the public view about nuclear energy is divided, and pro and con after Fukushima accident, but I believe that the nuclear energy is indispensable for Japan, and I am going to explain why. But let me share. Okay. Okay. Well, let me begin. More specifically, I'm going to present 4 points. Number one, major countries target to address climate change. Number two, nuclear is an essential part of energy mix toward 2050 in Japan. And number three, severe winter proved the resilience of nuclear energy. Number four, different countries can have different energy mix, but again, nuclear is an essential element in many cases, many countries. First, it's about major countries' targets. This is a rather messy table, but showing the GHG reduction targets of major countries as of today. Now more than 120 countries and regions declared to aim at the carbon neutrality by mid-century. They are major European countries, United Kingdom, France, Germany, EU as a whole, and China, South Korea, and Canada. And Japan is no exception, and Biden administration of the United States has also announced the carbon neutrality by 2050. If you look at the column, the budget, you could find a huge expenditure committed for infrastructure improvement as well as R&D. Some countries such as the EU and US characterized those expenditure as green or green recovery exercise from the adverse impact of COVID-19. Many countries announced more substantial or deeper GHG reduction targets, so-called national determined contribution for 2030, in response to the Paris Agreement by Climate Summit late April. The United 50% reduction deepened from 26 or 28 percent. EU deepened up to 55% reduction from 40%. Japan is directing now further at 46% reduction from 26. Well, this is showing the basic scenario among the possible energy mix scenarios in 2050 in Japan, which is being deliberated at the advisory committee to Met Minister, where I'm one of the members. According to this basic scenario, electrification will go on and almost 50% of final energy consumption will be electricity. 50-60% of power generation can be from renewable energy, 10% can be from zero carbon hydrogen or ammonia, and 30 or 40% can be the sum of nuclear energy and CCUS. Here are different views over how much should be nuclear, or 20% or 10%, or even some people like to see 0%. But if it is 10%, we don't have to decide whether the new construction of nuclear reactors or replacement of old nuclear reactors by new ones. But if it is 20%, we have to make a decision now whether we allow such new construction or replacement. This is the previous energy mix for 2030 with 26% GHG reduction, although new energy mix in 2030 is being discussed. According to this energy mix, 20 or 24% is from renewable energy, and 20 or 20% is 22% is from nuclear energy. By this energy mix, we try to reduce the share of nuclear energy from the level of 50%, which was a target before the Fukushima accident, to almost half of that target. Therefore, we don't have to think the new construction or replacement seriously for the moment until 2030 under the previous energy mix, because we have sufficient number of nuclear reactors, 36 reactors even after the accident. By the way, we used to have 54 nuclear reactors before the accident. Therefore, we could avoid politically sensitive questions about the new construction or replacement. Why politically sensitive? This table shows you the public acceptance of nuclear energy in major countries. In Germany, the clear majority was against nuclear energy even before the Fukushima accident. And that is why I understand they decided to phase out from nuclear energy with more people against after the accident. On the other hand, in Japan, the majority supported nuclear energy before the accident. But after the accident, more people are against nuclear energy, but not yet the majority. So the view is divided. This international comparison of public poll was conducted in 2011, just after the accident, but the situation remains almost unchanged even 10 years after the accident. So this divided public view urges us to make clearly a difficult and political sensitive decision. But now we are discussing the energy mix in 2050, when the aging existing nuclear reactors would have to retire even after the usage is extended up to 60 years. Deep blue area is showing how the nuclear reactors is going to retire. Uh, if we try to keep 20% share for nuclear in 2050, we have to decide to allow new construction or replacement of nuclear reactors now. And let us think about the role of nuclear energy objectively. This is the case for Japan. The appropriate energy mix differs among countries based on the endowment of energy for the respective countries. When we think about the appropriate energy mix in Japan, we usually examine whether the retirement of 3E plus S could be satisfied, namely energy security, economic cost, environment, and safety. We tend to think that no energy is perfect from the standpoint of this 3E plus S requirement. Safety has become a premise for us to think about energy mix after the Fukushima accident. Now we have three kinds of zero carbon energy to achieve carbon neutrality. Renewable energy, clearly, and nuclear energy, yes, and newly decarbonized fossil fuel, such as zero carbon hydrogen ammonia. Let us look at one by one. This chart shows the degree of endowment of solar and wind power by region. That part implies the abundance of solar or wind. Unfortunately, in Japan and in southern East Asia, we cannot see much red area, meaning that we are not endowed richly with solar and wind. So our capacity factor are not necessarily high. This is simply indicating that we have many rainy days, or cloudy days, and wind-free days. Sometimes we have a typhoon, but then we need to stop windmills because winds are too strong and damage the mills. In addition to that, Japan is a mountainous country and does not have a lot of flat land suitable for solar power or onshore wind power. Installed solar PV capacity per area, especially per flat area, is so high compared with the major countries. For instance, compared with the United States, 40 times larger capacity in terms of installed solar PV capacity per flat area. How about offshore wind power? Again, unfortunately, potential area of offshore windmill is almost 1/8 of United Kingdom. We should promote as much as possible, but we have to understand there is a limit, which can be translated into economic cost, namely affordability. Regarding the cost comparison, I will come back later. again. Now, let us move to discuss the value of decarbonized hydrocarbon. This is a chart to explain what the circular carbon economy means. We would produce zero carbon hydrogen from fossil fuel with CCS, particularly from gas in the context of CCE, circular carbon economy. For our technology, reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove are important elements for CCE, not to increase the CO2 in the air, which was advocated by Saudi Arabia government at the G20 last year, and Japanese government strongly supported. This table is attempting to introduce various technology for zero carbon hydrogen is a typical example of decarbonized hydrocarbon. The biggest challenge for this zero carbon hydrogen, ammonia, or other CCUS products, such as synthetic fuels or methanation, is cost reduction. At this moment, they are still 3 times or 5 times more expensive than comparable energy, such as oil and gas. R&D promotion and international collaboration need to be promoted to reduce costs. Last year, Aramco and IEJ, with a few Japanese companies, jointly tried to demonstrate that zero carbon ammonia can be transported from Saudi Arabia to Japan, and such ammonia, zero carbon ammonia, can be co-burned at coal-fired plant or gas-fired plant to reduce CO2 emissions to the extent of mixture as well as single firing of ammonia. The demonstration was very much successful. The challenge is clearly cost reduction. This chart is showing how much reduction is necessary by source and by country or by region. Cost reduction can be clearly possible for decarbonized fossil fuel, but it takes time and it is uncertain over when the cost comes down. So here comes the reason for us to think about the role of nuclear energy. When we think about nuclear energy, how we can evaluate, as I showed you, 3 E requirements. All of them are satisfied for nuclear energy. It is good for environment. It is zero carbon energy. It is good for energy security because it takes 4 or 5 years for the uranium to be burnt in Japan, meaning that we have almost 4 or 5 years stockpiling. This chart or table is showing how many nuclear reactors in operation. Dead portion in operation. The current share of nuclear in Japan is 6% only, with 9 reactors in operation as shown in this table. While the target is 2030 is 20 or 22%, after the accident, all the reactors are shut down and are deoperated when newly established NRA permit them to deoperate in light of new stringent regulation. In order to meet the requirement of energy mix target in 2030, about 30 reactors need to be deoperated. There are still 36 reactors available in Japan, and the only question is whether the inspection can be accelerated with learning curve for both NRA and the power companies. Currently, 1 reactor per year. This is a speed, but it should be accelerated. This graph is attempting to show the power generation cost, which was studied at the cost working group at METI in Japan. Nuclear energy is one of the lowest energy in terms of cost, while cost of renewable energy goes up when its share increases because of system cost. Power generation costs differ among regions. Japan is a region country where the cost of nuclear energy is at least one of the lowest. On the right-hand side, you could see the cost curve in Japan And bright green is going to show the cost of nuclear energy. So it's much lower than even coal-fired plant. Again, going back to 3E plus S principle, no energy is perfect in Japan. We can say the portfolio approach or balanced energy mix approach is the most appropriate as far as Japan is concerned. Furthermore, two power crises are telling us that nuclear is resilient energy. This winter was very severe, and we saw power crisis at least in Japan and in Texas. In the both cases, we had a lot of problems due to very low temperature or a lot of snow. Regarding the renewable energy, wind power in Texas and solar power in Japan. Besides, we had supply disruption for gas, again due to cold weather, frozen pipeline in Texas, and sudden increase in gas demand in Northern Asia. In both regions, the spot price of gas skyrocketed. This is a comparison of failure rate by power source in Texas this winter. All the energy were affected by severe winter, but it is clear that the most affected is wind power, while the least affected is nuclear. It seems that a balanced energy mix approach can be applicable not only to Japan, but also to many countries or regions. Last but not least, I would like to share the energy mix in 2050 of major countries which I could identify as of today. Energy mix could differ among countries in light of the endowment of energy, the degree of regional connectivity, and sense of security. Most of them try to have a balanced energy mix in one way or another. And nuclear is one of the important elements of energy mix in major countries. Let us have a quick look. This is a case for EU. The share of nuclear is 12 or 15% yellow portion. Please look at the yellow portion only. This is the case for UK, 11% for nuclear. This is a case for France, 50% for 2035, while the share in 25 is not yet decided. I understand it is being discussed. And a case for China, about 16%. Well, with that, let me conclude my presentation. No energy is perfect in Japan from 3E plus S standpoint. Balanced energy mix portfolio approach is essential in Japan to realize carbon neutrality by 2050, and nuclear energy is indispensable. The recent severe winter also gave a lesson indicating that nuclear energy is quite resilient. It is natural to see different energy mix among countries, but nuclear is an important part, not only in Japan, but also in many countries or regions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Diane, for your presentation. This is a very timely reminder of the importance of nuclear in the energy mix, and sometimes we get carried away with thinking that it's all about renewables and wind and solar, and we forget that we have non-carbon producing electricity source that we know, that we understand, and that we know how to operate, that is available to us. And thank you so very much for reminding us of all of the value that energy has for us, and all it can do for us. And coming from France, it's very interesting because we see the same debate that the one that you're having about we have this source of energy, we know, we understand it, we know how to manage it, we know how to run it, and yet there's a lot of discussions about it. And I think our job as engineers, our job is to really explain to people why we think it's the one of the answers to the decarbonization challenge. And that, thank you so very much for your presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which I believe is going to be Salma Bilbao y Leon. She's the Director General of the World Nuclear Association. She's coming from Spain. She's worked in the nuclear engineering industry for a long time, and she's going to tell us about her vision and the work that they have done at the World Nuclear Association about the importance of the nuclear industry and how it can help us solve the decarbonization challenge. It is hard to understate the importance of reducing the carbon emission in our economy. I'm just going to give you a single fact. Today, there was a piece in the Financial Times. By 2025, which, as you can count, is less than 4 years from now, we will probably, I'm not saying it's certain, but it's going to be probable, we'll probably have 1 year where the temperature is going to be more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial age. It's not going to be a string of many years, but it's going to be 1 year where we're going to have more than 1.5 degrees. So we need all the solutions on board to solve the decarbonization challenge. It is a burning issue. And with that, Sama, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Let me share my screen over here. So hopefully you are seeing my screen right now. So let me start first of all by thanking the International Association for Energy Engineers and the Institute of Energy and Engineering in Japan for this kind invitation. I am thrilled to be here and to share this virtual stage with good friends and obviously very eminent people such as Toyoda-san and Diane Cameron, which is really a pleasure. So let me start by I really want to give you a little bit of an idea of the point of view of the global nuclear industry as we look at the very important role that we think that nuclear energy can have moving forward in all these net zero scenarios that we are seeing. So all the information that I'm going to share with you today is being extracted from many publications. You will find the references from everything that I will discuss. And in particular, a lot of this information comes from our publications. And of course, anybody is welcome to visit our website to download all this information. So normally I like to start my presentations by perhaps framing the size and the urgency of the climate challenge that we have in front of us. And I think that these graphics that you have in front of you really show that very, very clearly. So you see that the percentage of zero carbon or low carbon electricity today is essentially the same that it was at the beginning of the 21st century. So this means that despite these very large investments that we have done in renewable energy sources and decarbonization, we really are not moving forward very fast. In fact, we have barely moved. And also, Toyoda-san had a slide in his presentation detailing the progress that we are making so far towards this goal of 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees reduction. So, I think that according to the commitments that we need to make, we need to reach about a 43% globally. And if you look at the recent summary, the recent compilation that the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change just did, adding up the commitments in all the national determined contributions, they reach about 0.5%. So essentially we are at 0.5% versus 43%. Not very good. So, and let me just say this gets even more interesting when we realize that for less developed nations, their priority is socio-economic development. So obviously, yes, they would like to do this while decarbonizing their economies, but clearly the priority is to achieve this decarbonization in a just and equal manner, in a way that all humans in the world can actually achieve the same standard of living that luckily we are able to achieve in developed countries in Europe, North America, and Japan, obviously. So the size of the channel, the challenge is huge. So within this challenge, nuclear energy has an incredibly important role to play. When you look at many of the scenarios, many of the projections that we have seen from very highly reputable organizations, such as the International Energy Agency of the IPCC, the International Atomic Energy Agency, you see that in all the projections, nuclear energy does take a very important role. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but obviously always has a very important role. And something that is important to notice is that all these projections consider the role of nuclear energy only for electricity production. But I do want to remind all of you that nuclear energy is the only low carbon energy source that can not only produce electricity, as I just mentioned, but also heat. And this is very important because it actually provides the very exciting opportunity to actually use nuclear energy to decarbonize other very hard to abate sectors beyond electricity. So like, for example, we can use nuclear energy for district heating, which has been used in many parts of the world. We can use nuclear energy for the production of fresh water through desalination. We can use nuclear energy for many industrial processes, whether it is the chemical industry, whether it is cement or steel or concrete. Many high energy intensive industries could use electricity and heat from nuclear power. And then of course, we can also use nuclear energy for the production of zero carbon hydrogen, which is becoming a very important energy vector as we all try to go towards net zero energy systems. So obviously we can use electricity and heat that nuclear produces to produce affordable and zero carbon hydrogen that of course could be instrumental to decarbonize many sectors. Of course, we talked about industrial sectors, but also it could be instrumental either directly or through ammonia or through synthetic fuels to decarbonize heavy transport, such as, for example, for the shipping industry or the air transportation industry. So again, very excellent opportunities to go much more beyond electricity. And the beauty is that, of course, we know that nuclear energy not only can do this moving forward, but in fact, we have a good story to tell because we have been doing this for the last 5 decades. As you know, nuclear energy is today the single largest source of low carbon electricity in developed countries, and actually the second one at a global level, second only to hydropower. So clearly that is a very, very good track record. So nuclear power plants have operated safely, reliably, and cost effectively all over the world for more than 60 years. And of course, that has already avoided the emission of many carbon gases, greenhouse gases, but also many other contaminants. So we are talking about beyond carbon, we are also talking about clean air and clean water. So that is a great good news already. When we look at also the economics of nuclear, which of course are very, very important, in a recent report that was jointly produced by the International Energy Agency and the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, we saw how existing nuclear and new nuclear are definitely competitive among all energy sources, but in particular when we look at low carbon energy sources. So these are also very good news. And then moving forward, I think it's great to know that nuclear has been doing a good job so far, but it's very exciting to see a lot of new projects and new innovation that is coming into the nuclear industry. So I will not go through all these photos that I have shown you here, but I think it's very exciting to see two new nuclear countries, the United Arab Emirates and Belarus, that just recently in 2020 joined the global nuclear family. And then it is also very exciting to see many projects that are moving us beyond the traditional large light water reactors, which still can be very important and very useful in many countries of the world. But there are additional options for countries when they can use small modular reactors or advanced reactors that use new technologies and new options. And this in particular, I would say that small modular reactors, they truly can be a game changer for the use of nuclear industry, because obviously they offer very interesting financial benefits. They are going to be more affordable, more scalable, and they this way offer a much shorter payback. And then again, they also offer new business models, because obviously they are going to be built in a shorter time, and they offer perhaps a less risky financing case, because obviously the overall capital outlay is going to be much smaller. So those are very exciting. And as I said, they really can be designed specifically to take advantage of some of these new applications, some of these new markets that I mentioned earlier when I talk about electricity and heat. So in this sense, we really think that innovation within the nuclear industry is absolutely indispensable to seize the opportunities that we see ahead of us, and also, just as importantly, to face the challenges. So we think that is really important to make sure that we sustain and enhance the global capabilities of the current nuclear sector. And that includes the research and development, our capabilities in the operation of the current fleet, and of course the supply chain and the regulatory aspects. But we really need to move forward beyond that. We need to accelerate the incorporation of disruptive technologies at a global level. So, and of course, that is going to help us get small modular reactors, advanced reactors deployed effectively and quickly around the world. And for that, we really are going to need to transform the nuclear regulatory sector to make sure that we can deploy cost effectively and timely these new technologies at an international level. So of course, for that, multilateral collaboration is going to be indispensable, both at the industry level, but just as importantly at the government level. So I would say that the nuclear industry is keenly aware that we really need to work together, and we really need to get our act together in order to really demonstrate all these promises that we are making. But I would say that the role of the nuclear sector is the government is very important to support the nuclear sector. So this is basically my last message, perhaps. So government support is going to be very important to create confidence and to really incentivize the long-term planning and investment in these technologies. So this is going to really provide the guidance that the nuclear regulatory agencies are going to need to streamline processes. Is really going to create a level playing field in markets and in overall policies that obviously will allow nuclear to be able to be in the same level playing field with other low carbon energy sources. And finally, and just as importantly, is going to help unlock the low cost finance that we need for nuclear to compete with other low carbon energy courses. So let me just finalize with maybe a huge message from our side. I mean, we really need to instill a sense of urgency about the important role that nuclear is going to take in this net zero carbon energy systems of the future. And with this, I stop and I will return the word to the moderator. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Sama, for this very inspiring presentation. And I think you're very right. The point that we sometimes forget is that if we want to have a global nuclear industry, we need to have somehow a coordination of the regulatory approaches among countries so that all providers of nuclear capacity can compete worldwide and not just within each country. So thank you so very much for reminding us of that. Now I'd like to welcome the next speaker, who is Diane. Diane comes from Canada, where she's coming from Canada, right? So Diane Cameron, she's the head of nuclear technology development and economics division at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency. She's been well, as I said, she comes from Canada. She worked in the Canadian administration, and she's going to tell us the OECD perspective on the nuclear future, and in particular, from what I understand, what your work is today, Diane, you're going to talk to us about the small modular reactor and what it could mean for the industry's future. And building on what Sama said, I understand that having a common regulatory framework is going to be essential for making small modular reactors a reality in the future. Diane, it's all up to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Diane Cameron. I'm presently the head of the Division for Nuclear Technology Development and Economics at the NEA, the Nuclear Energy Agency, which is a part of the OECD family. Until recently, I was Director of Nuclear Energy Policy for the Government of Canada. And it's absolutely my pleasure to be joining you today. Thank you so much to the IAEE and the IEEJ for organizing this very timely discussion. And actually, the slides that I've prepared for today are around sort of towards an understanding of the economics of nuclear energy in a carbon constrained future, but I do get to small modular reactors at the end of my presentation, and I would be very, very happy to discuss SMRs, or nuclear innovation small modular reactors, in our discussion today. But let's dive right in now to the next slide, please, and get started here with some work on the economics front. I don't know, oh, there we go. The first thing I'd like to do today is introduce a framework for thinking about the costs of electricity. And in this framework, first we have the plant level costs of generation, which include, amongst other costs, things like the costs of actual concrete and steel used to build the plant, as well as the fuel and human resources to operate the plant. When we talk as economists about levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, we're usually talking about plant level costs. Although some LCOE calculations do include some externalities that have been internalized into the plant level costs. For example, if you're operating in a context where there's a price on carbon or where there's a legislated requirement to internalize the end of life cycle costs into operating costs. So that's the first level, plant level costs. Next, we have grid level costs. And these are the costs, sorry, still on the same slide. These are grid level costs are the costs that generating units impose on the broader system, including the costs of delivering electricity from generating plants to customers. In other words, the connection, distribution, transmission costs. But equally important at the grid level are the costs associated with compensating for the variability and uncertainty in the supply from generating plants. And this includes, for example, the costs of maintaining spinning reserves or additional dispatchable capacity that can be ramped up when variable sources are unavailable. And lastly, for completeness, we have the social and environmental costs that different technologies impose on the well-being of people and communities, including negative externalities like pollution and climate change, but also some positive externalities such as employment and economic development or spin-off benefits from technology innovation. And these are the externalities that are not accounted for in plant level LCOE or grid level costs. The point here is to establish a framework that allows us to compare costs across different generating options and different generating mixes, such that we're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And to do so requires a systems level perspective. Next slide, please. So taking that systems level perspective, we define total system costs then as the sum of plant level generating costs plus grid level system costs. Taking the systems perspective factors in something we call profile costs. Those are the grid level costs imposed by variability or intermittency. Balancing costs, these are the grid level costs imposed by uncertainty in generation. And connection, distribution, and transmission costs, the costs of delivering electricity from distributed power generation sources to customers. To be clear, variable, intermittent, and uncertain sources of power generation impose greater grid level system costs, which is why it is so important to take a systems level perspective when comparing costs of variable renewables with costs of nuclear or baseload hydro or fossil generation. In other words, it is this systems level analysis that allows us to compare apples to apples. Turning to the next slide, please. Having set out this framework for thinking about system costs, and this is a graph that Sama shared as well, so I'm going to unpack it a little bit for you. Having set out this framework for thinking about the system costs of different generating options, I'd like to now present the key findings from a recent joint IEA-NEA report on the projected costs of electricity. Analysis of the system costs for more than 20 IEA and NEA member countries led us to the notable conclusion that the lowest cost option for generating electricity is long-term operations of nuclear power plants, and by a significant margin, which you can see here. Equally notable is the finding about the range of costs for solar and wind generation, and that's shown by the whiskers on this bar and whiskers graph. Wind and solar endowments depend heavily on regional characteristics and conditions. If you'd like to unpack these figures further, I would invite you to check out the LCOE calculator, that a screenshot of which was included in Sama's presentation, which is available on the IEA-NEA website, where you can play with the key parameters and assumptions. And we trust that you'll find, as we did, that these findings are quite robust and with significant policy implications that we'll get to in a moment. Turning to the next slide, please. In reality, though, most grids include a mix generating options, generating sources. So I'd like to now take a look at the total costs for a range of scenarios, ranging from our base case here shown on the left with 0% variable renewables. Then as we move across the bar graph, we're adding 10% variable renewables, 50% variable renewables, up to 75% variable renewables. And what you can see clearly is that as the share of variable renewables increases, total costs rise. This is because of two factors. One, the average plant level costs rise, though this finding depends somewhat on regional endowments, which we saw in the last slide. But more importantly, the system costs grow significantly as the growing share of variable renewables imposes greater and greater costs on the grid for stability and flexibility. And on the right-hand graph, you can see the breakdown of system costs as the share of variable renewables grows from 10% to 75% in the mix. And that includes profile costs to compensate for the variability and intermittency, connection and distribution and transmission costs, as well as balancing costs, which are quite small for to compensate for uncertainty. A key finding here is that the profile costs, which are the costs that compensate for variability and intermittency on the rest of the grid, are the dominant driver for increasing total costs as the share of variable renewables grows. Turning to the next slide, please. So next, I'd like to share with you a closer look at what happens when we drive the system with carbon constraints to zero, aiming to get to that net zero 2050 emissions target. The graph on the left is this 3D graph. It comes from a landmark MIT study from about 2019, which used the same modeling approach that we've been talking about in this presentation today, that we first introduced in an NEA system cost study in 2010, which has been the basis of the framework that we've been talking about here today. The vertical axis on this 3D graph shows system costs as a function of carbon constraints, which is shown on the axis that's sort of heading to the left, and the share of variable renewables in the mix, which is shown increasing on that axis that kind of heads off to the right. In the previous slide, I showed you how total costs increase significantly in scenarios with high shares of variable renewables. On this graph, that would be like cutting the 3D image along the blue line, which cuts at a carbon constraint of approximately 50 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour. But take a look at what happens as we move that line back, where we're ratcheting up carbon constraints and moving towards the red line, which represents net zero emissions. The relationship between the share of variable renewables and system costs, which is driven by those profile costs I talked about to compensate for variability, is even more pronounced. In a nutshell, what does this mean? We may be able to reduce emissions to meet 2030 targets by growing the share of variable renewables in the mix. But the costs of reaching 2050 targets of net zero on the back of variable renewables are likely to be prohibitive. So why is this? In part because initially, as you introduce variable renewables, you can backstop with low cost options like natural gas. But eventually, in a carbon constrained world, your options for backstopping variable renewables become increasingly expensive. The policy implications here are significant. Policies to achieve 2030 targets may look like progress towards 2050 net zero targets, but they may be deceiving. And I'd like to share with you an example from my home country of Canada in the province of Saskatchewan. So the province of Saskatchewan has been historically well endowed with fossil energies, coal, but is required by Canadian legislation to take all coal offline by 2030, which is true for all Canadian provinces. Taking coal offline and replacing it with a mix of variable renewables backstopped by natural gas could enable Saskatchewan to reach its 2030 emissions, because that would be less polluting or less emitting than coal. But to get to net zero, they'll then have to take natural gas offline and replace it with something that can still backstop those variable renewables. And in the absence of natural gas, this becomes increasingly difficult and increasingly costly. And that's the dynamic that you're seeing on this graph. This is illustrated on the right-hand graph also. To reach net zero on the back of variable renewables, we replace natural gas with a mix of battery storage and hydro storage, for example. And owing to the variability of wind and solar, you can see that we have to build out more and more generating capacity, overshooting the actual demand side in order, so here in the form of variable renewables and batteries, in order to hit the likely demand, the expected demand. So we have to overbuild generating capacity, which also contributes to growing total costs. And on the very right-hand side of that right-hand graphic, we show the results of an optimization model, which leads us to conclude that the most cost-effective replacement for natural gas as we drive to a net zero future, where we're looking at our 2050 targets as opposed to just looking at our 2030 targets, is nuclear energy. So turning to my next slide, please. This is my last slide. Here we're showing the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, the SDS set out to 2040. In this scenario, the IEA projects that the world needs to build out more nuclear generating capacity, reaching approximately 600 gigawatts gross of nuclear power by 2040. For all the reasons we've talked about today, a net zero scenario would require even greater build out of global nuclear capacity. Next slide. This is great. Thank you. For all the reasons we've talked about today. So this is the SDS scenario. But if we were talking about the net zero scenario, you would need even more nuclear than is shown in this graph. But let's just start with the SDS scenario. On this graph in blue is the projected global installed nuclear capacity out to 2040 from the existing fleet. In green is the projected global nuclear installed capacity expected from large scale new builds, nuclear new builds. And in red is the gap. What the SDS scenario requires in terms of global installed capacity versus what we are on track to deliver from existing and expected large scale nuclear. This is the installed capacity gap. So are we on track? Sadly, no, not even for the SDS scenario, let alone for the net zero scenario. So that's the installed capacity gap in red, but there's also a policy gap. Another important key takeaway from this graph goes to the urgency that the others have spoken about today as well, the urgency of action to resolve this gap. Whereas installed capacity gap does not become apparent until sort of the 2030 to 2040 time range, the policy gap is immediate. Because of the planning timelines required for nuclear energy projects, decisions need to be taken in the next, I would say, 1 to 3 years maximum to fill the installed capacity gap with a combination of life extension of existing nuclear and new nuclear. Now, I said this is my last slide, but I don't want to leave you depressed and demoralized. There is a glimmer of hope. And in particular, I would like to leave you with this thought. There is a pipeline of nuclear innovation that could transform this picture significantly. Advanced and small modular reactors, or SMRs, could be game changers. With the right enabling policy measures, because for me, it always comes back to policy. With the right enabling policy measures, SMRs could be commercialized in the coming 5 to 10 years. We're talking about near-term innovation. This is not something 20, 30 years out. It's not nuclear fusion. It is happening, and it's happening soon. And these SMRs could create options that are well suited for a variety of applications, including replacing coal power plants around the world, micro SMR reactors, very small units, as options that could replace diesel, providing non-emitting power off-grid to resource extraction sites, mining operations in remote communities, and high-temperature nuclear technologies that could provide the first real non-emitting alternative to natural gas cogen or combined heat and power for heavy industries, including oil sands extraction, including steel, chemicals, any of those heavy industries that are really hard to abate for actual deep decarbonization of the global economy. And I'm happy to chat more about SMRs and the pipeline and what the enabling policies, including the regulatory work that needs to be done to enable this to happen. But I leave my slides and my presentation here for now. This ray of hope around nuclear innovation concludes my presentation. So thank you for your attention today.
Thank you very much, Diane. That's a great presentation. Thank you very much. The one point I want to emphasize is the point about the LCOE. It was actually an old paper from Paul Josko and Dick Schmalenzi. I think it was in 2002. It was a long time ago when they showed that we should not use the LCOE to compare the different technologies. And thank you so very much for bringing back that insight that indeed some of the renewables might have very low cost of producing megawatt hours, but they don't produce at every hour. You cannot control them. You have reserves point, as you mentioned that, and as you showed that, there's a systems cost component to it. And we should not just listen to LCOEs, even though they are good news. We should just not listen to that. And thank you for reminding us that it's a more complex problem than that. And that, I think, is the challenge we face as an industry, which is, as power engineers, we understand the complexity of running a power system, and we understand the richness of it. And for, decision makers, and I don't want to throw the stone at policymakers, but they just look at the LCA and say, yeah, it's going down, so we're all good. Well, and I hate to say that because I'm going to sound like my mother, but we know better. We know that it's a complicated system, and we have to take into account the richness of the cost. And thank you so much for reminding us of that. The other point that you touched upon, which I think is essential, is SMRs, because the view that people have in their mind is, nuclear reactors, big machines. And what you just said is, no, it's not true. We can build them smaller. We can apply them to smaller problems. And I think our job is to show to people, to convince people that it actually doesn't have to be a big machine. And by the way, being French, we are very guilty of that, because our flagship product is a 1600 megawatt nuclear power plant. And it's huge. 1600 megawatt is huge. And what you just told us is, look, you can think of nuclear in a different way. You can have smaller reactors that can be applied to different usages. So thank you so very much for that. Now, I realize we're getting the end of the time. Is there any time for questions? How does that work from there? Can we interact with our speakers, or are we exhausted the time we have available for them?
Thank you, Thomas. Really, at this point in time, we can entertain questions.
Excellent.
And there are a couple that have come into the Q&A section you can pick up on if you wish. Would you like to field those questions under the Q&A?
Boom, 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 boom. I don't see any questions. I apologize. I'm going to be a bit unprepared here, but I don't see the questions in the Q&A section. Oh, now I see them. So there's a first question about. Okay, so let me just do that then. There's a first question about Japan, and industry is increasing from 300 to 330 million tons. And I think it's for Toyoda-san to answer that question.
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's a very interesting question. I didn't notice until such a question is raised, but I think we could differentiate energy intensity and GHG intensity. Clearly in Japan, energy intensity is improving. And in terms of GHG intensity, well, even if it is improved, if the share of hard to abate industry goes up, GHG would increase. Actually, in Japan, what I can guess is that many sort of assembly type of industry are going out of Japan. They are going to China, they are going to ASEAN country, but it is interesting to note that most steel industry stay in Japan, pulp industry stay in Japan, chemical industry in Japan, and so this is from this information is from the government, and so I think it is true. And then what I can guess is that the share of hard to abate industry increasing, but clearly we have to make them really zero carbon, and how we can do that, and that's a very important question. And most of them trying to utilize hydrogen. Clearly, electricity is good, but difficult to utilize electricity because it's high cost, and so most of them trying to develop the low cost hydrogen at this moment, and so yes, it's very interesting phenomena, but I hope they could do reduce CO2 and eventually go to zero carbon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toyoda-san. There was another question from Robert Fisher, and maybe that's one for Sama or Diane that could answer. Biomass, especially district heating in Nordic country, also produces carbon neutral heat and electricity. So what do we do about it? I don't know, Diane or Sama, whether you have an answer to that.
Sure, I'm happy to say a few things about that. The first thing is to acknowledge that the regional endowments vary by location, and every region needs to be taking into consideration its endowments to come up with the right mix of non-emitting heat and power for its jurisdiction and its citizenry. So if biomass is working in that context, great. But as a global solution, let's just keep in mind the energy density of biomass compared to the energy density of nuclear, of uranium. They don't compare. And so it's really when you start to look at the scale. So there are definitely some local and regional and niche markets where we should be taking advantage of every non-emitting option that's available to us. But when we look at the scale of the global problem, or the global challenge, so the global challenge ahead of us, the importance of nuclear, in large part because of its energy density, is indisputable. I don't know, Sama, if you would add anything to that.
Not very much. No, I think that Diane covered most of what I was going to say. I mean, and I think that the key is exactly that. So using one energy source does not necessarily mean that you need to exclude another one. Each country will need to figure out what is the optimum mix of resources given their endowments, given their socioeconomic situation, given their culture, their history. So if biomass is available and will fit the needs, that's perfect. If not, there are other choices. I mean, and I would say that in particular, in Nordic countries, the nuclear power plants that we have currently in these countries, they are also providing district heating in their local areas. So again, it is one thing does not exclude the other.
Thank you. There are two other families of question, three families of question. One is about getting some slides and the tools, the LCOE calculator tools in particular. So that we can take later. There are two other questions, two other families of question. One is about nuclear waste, which I think is an important question. And I thought I was a very Danielle raised that question, says, look, you look at the cost. What about the cost of nuclear waste? And I guess that the question extends to not only waste storage, but also decommissioning and all. So that's one of the families of question. The other families of question is when we look at developing countries, which do not have yet fully agreed like we have in Europe or in North America that produces power, 99% or 99.999% of the time. What's the view on that? So those are two families of question: developing countries and waste, and more generally decommissioning costs. Dan, maybe you want to start with decommissioning costs, and then we can move on. Maybe Sama can answer also, and then we can move on developing countries. What you guys views on that?
I was going to start if Diane doesn't mind.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean that.
I am ready. No. I was faster, so I will start. No, I will be happy to discuss that. I mean, I think that typically, the levelized cost of electricity for nuclear energy does include the cost of the long-term management of used nuclear fuel and radioactive waste, and also does include the cost of decommissioning the unit back to a green field. And of course, this is something that basically no other energy source can say. Clearly, the cost of any waste or any decommissioning is not included in the levelized cost of electricity of any other energy sources. So I mean, that is specifically to the cost. So I don't know if you want me to go any further than that.
I'm good with that. Diane, do you have anything other to add on the decommissioning issue or the storage issue?
No, I think that's the right point to make. This is a cost that is internalized into the costs of nuclear in most contexts, and the same cannot be said about other sources of power, where the end of life cycle costs have not necessarily been fully internalized. And so for me, this goes back again to comparing apples to apples as opposed to comparing apples to oranges. I think we absolutely should be taking a look at full life cycle costs when we compare costs across generating options. But in this case, actually, nuclear is already, for the most part, internalized those costs.
And if I can add something to the discussion, it just so happens that a very good friend of mine I was to college with, is responsible for decommissioning in France, and I can assure you, because I mean and I'm sure it's the case in France, and I'm pretty sure it's the case all over the world. From talking to my friend, again, it was a college friend, he's a very good friend, the level of attention and care about decommissioning costs and the impact we today are imposing on future generation, I think is superb in the power industry. It's not like we ignore whatever we're going to leave for the future generation. We take very good care, not only on the cost, as in dollar cost, but also in terms of the impact, potential impact. And when you talk to those guys, they really think through what are the issues of leaving some radioactive material in the ground for generations. And just an example, when I was talking to my friends, is look, we don't even know what kind of political system there will be in 500,000 years, whether there'll be democracies or not. So there's a very good, I think, care about those issues, and there's a very deep understanding of what we're doing. It's not random. It's just like we're dumping it and forgetting about it. Then I see you raise your hands.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I wonder if the question is motivated, and I think for many people, there might be two ideas that are being conflated here. So Sam and I are both talking about how the costs of back end of the fuel cycle, the end of life cycle costs, decommissioning and waste management, are fully internalized into the cost of electricity from nuclear. But there is a legacy waste issue at play that people might be aware of from the media, from the news. There is still sort of a post-World War II legacy waste issue in some countries where in that World War II effort, the priority at that time was on getting the innovation done in the context of the war effort, and there was a bunch of waste produced in that context that then was sort of a problem to be solved later. And so there are some legacy liabilities from that era that have to be dealt with. But as far as modern and operating nuclear power plants today and any new nuclear, I mean, the policy context is very clear. We've learned that lesson. You don't defer to tomorrow. The problem is solving the back end of the life cycle.
Thank you. Thanks. And there was another question. So there's a question from Rudy to Sama, but I think it works out true for you, Diane, is what's your perspective on developing countries? I mean, how do you get nuclear? And there were 3 or 4 different questions on nuclear in developing countries. And Sama, I'm going to ask you the question because that's the way it came out. how does the WNA look into nuclear planning of future deployment in the newcomer of developing countries? And maybe you want to take a first crack at it. And of course,
Yeah.
Diane, you want to, or maybe Toyoda-san, you want to say something about it too.
Right. I will start very briefly. So I would say that currently the organization that is really taking the lead in supporting newcomer countries that are interested in incorporating nuclear in their energy mix is probably the International Atomic Energy Agency. They have a very, very thorough program where they actually support the countries so they can develop the infrastructure that is needed in order to be able to accept a civilian nuclear energy program. So on our side, from the perspective of World Nuclear Association, we actually are supporting the International Atomic Energy Agency, bringing the expertise of the global nuclear industry. So we are organizing events in these countries that have already express an interest in nuclear, and we are putting them in touch with the different experts at a global level so they can have a first-hand impression of what would it take for them to adopt this technology. So I mean, again, it's an important decision, but as you said, the countries, they really need to look at the entire picture in order to move forward with what makes sense for the next, for not only today, but the next generation.
Diane, maybe? Or Toyoda-san?
Well,
Toyoda-san?
well, go ahead, please. Well, as far as Japan is concerned, um, uh, Japanese companies are ready to help those developing economies. They are ready to export facilities, and they are ready to support human resource development. They are ready to share the Japanese regulation, etc., etc. Actually, well, you know, among ASEAN countries, I think 2 or 3 countries trying to introduce nuclear energy, and we are working very closely with them. And particularly unfortunate accident in Fukushima could be a very good lesson. We are happy to share such experience, and what could be sort of right or type of regulation. Already as Institute of Energy, we are working very closely with our counterparts in ASEAN economies. And we are closely working with many other countries, even outside Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane, maybe another word?
Sure. So for those members of the audience who are new to nuclear as a sector, the first thing to know is that there is a United Nations organization called the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and that body is responsible for setting expectations and standards and guidelines for nuclear safety and security, nuclear safeguards, and non-proliferation. So in most countries, they also do peer reviews and inspections and to ensure compliance with the highest standards. And most supplier countries of nuclear, say Canada, the United States, Japan, France, the UK, Korea, will not do trade, will not export to a country that does not sign on to the highest levels of IAEA standards and protocols. So that's the first thing to know. So when we're talking about new embarking countries in the nuclear space, there is a process of capacity building, of creating the right regulatory setting, creating the regulator in that national context, in that, and the capacity building in that country. There is a process that takes time to build up the safeguards and the regulatory regime. And most supplier countries, such as Toyoda-san just mentioned, like Japan, and the same is true with all the others, will work with embarking countries to build up that capacity, because this only works if we do it in a manner that's safe and secure. So, we've started to do the analysis, for example, around the global potential for small modular reactors. And we estimate the market will exceed somewhere on the order of $200 billion US per year by 2040. That's the market demand. But that cuts across a lot of markets that are existing nuclear power generating jurisdictions, but also a lot of new markets, including developing countries. And so the next level of analysis that needs to be done is around, of that theoretical demand, how much of that is an accessible market? How many of those markets exist in countries where they have the ability to do the IAEA process, sign on to those standards, establish a sovereign regulator, work collaboratively with supplier countries, and deploy nuclear safely and securely? There will be some contexts just to ease the minds of and worries of anyone in the audience. There will be some countries that that don't qualify, that will be kept out of this because of the country is not yet stable enough or what have you. So that's what I would say about this. I think there's an enormous potential, and anyone who says that, well, anyways, we'll just leave it as there's an enormous potential. And one of the things I sometimes hear, maybe I will actually go there. One of the things I sometimes hear is that we would be expecting too much of a developing country. And I just find that to be pejorative, sort of paternalistic, neo-colonial. There's absolutely no reason why developing countries around the world cannot build up the capacity and develop these competencies. And I mentioned at one point in my presentation, there are a lot of positive externalities to engaging in nuclear innovation and the nuclear sector. There's a lot of spin-off economic developments. There's a lot of really good economic development reasons to join the nuclear family.
Thanks, Diane. One observation, and that's more of a personal observation, but I'm come from an academic background, so I spent most of my life in academia. And when I joined EDF, which is a large nuclear company, I was always very impressed by I would say the word you would use is restraint from nuclear power engineers, be them in operations or new development, and they are very concerned about the challenges of running or building new power plants, and they don't. And I've always been impressed by their caution about what it takes to operate a power plant, and they are much more cautious. And if I make a personal comment here that does not engage the IAEA, they're much more cautious about that than many politicians we can meet or hear or listen to. So I would not, I personally am not. I mean, that's my opinion. I'm not worried about those aspects, because I think nuclear engineers are very responsible, and they're grown up in the responsibility of operating very complex machines and be very careful about that. I think we've exhausted the questions we have in the Q&A. There are some questions about getting the documents online, but that I think they're addressed differently. So, Mr. Chairman, I think we're good to go. I don't know if there are more time, more questions, how you want to run it.
I think we've probably exhausted the amount of time. I would like to thank you all very much for your time and your expertise. Clearly, this is a very important topic, very important energy source. And we need to do more of this conversation, more writing, more research on nuclear energy and its usability to help propel our society moving forward. So with this, I thank you all very much for your time again and your expertise. Please be reminded that this has been recorded, will be available online free of charge on our website, probably within the next 24 hours. And I wish you all a good evening or good day where this finds you on our fine globe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.